Um, Today we are going to discuss sociology theory and methods. So for this week, these are the videos that you should watch for this week. The first day of class intro video, the sociological imagination video, and then the sociology theory and methods. So those are the lectures that you should be watching for this week. So we'll go right into it. Let's see. Go ahead. All right. And so the first thing, the sociological perspective. So we talked about on the last video, sociology is the scientific study of human activity and the social forces that influence or pressure people to behave, respond, or think in certain ways. So we talked about the fact that sociology is, and we're going to talk about that in more detail at the end of this lecture. It is part of the scientific process. We use the scientific process to look at human activity. We talked a lot about social forces in the last video. So if you haven't watched the last video, if you haven't looked at the PowerPoint related to it, I suggest you do that so that you can know a little bit more about, we talked about what human activity is, and we also went into a lot of detail about social forces. So check that out. When we look at sociology, just to give a little bit more information on it, and the reason why I think this is important, why I do a whole lecture just on theory and methods, is because this class doesn't focus on theory, or this class doesn't focus on methods. We do talk a lot about theory and sociological theories, but we don't talk a lot about methods. So that's the reason, but methods are important. Because a lot of people say, okay, Professor Grant, you have us reading these essays. These are the conclusions these people came to. But how do we know that the methods in which they got this done was solid? These people said they did a study, but they could have did a study on 3 people, and came to these conclusions. I don't know how these people got the sample, how large was their sample size, like all these different things. So, and all that's very important. Those are solid questions. And if we want to go deeper into methods, we can. Methods can be kind of boring, but if you want to go deeper into research methods, just let me know. A lot of times when you see things published, especially if you're a person outside of the discipline or don't know a whole lot about that particular line of study, there's this kind of automatic assumption that the methods are already in place before it gets published or before it goes into a certain book or book chapter or whatever. But that's an assumption. That's not always the case. Some people have really faulty methods that get published. It happens all the time. So I would understand if somebody came to me and say, well, how did they come to this conclusion? Who did they study? How did they analyze this? What kind of bias? And if you want, you can, only look at studies that explain that. A lot of the studies that we're going to look at don't go into detail about that, or there are parts of the article or of the essay, or even of the book where I don't get that part out. But if you're interested in that, because most people don't care, most students don't care. But if you are a student that does care, and if you do want to know about the methods that Benea Silva uses, then you can go look at the book and you can go read that methods chapter. And then he'll tell you exactly, okay, this is how many people I interviewed. This is how I analyzed it. This is who used the material. This is how I transcribe and go through all the methods to ensure that this follows the scientific rules and to ensure that there was a bias that was eliminated to the highest degree possible, and all these different things. A solid sample size, make sure that the conclusions aren't necessarily generalizable if it's a qualitative study, particularly a qualitative study with a very low sample size, all the things that you may remember from a research methods class. So if you're interested in that, cool, but most people aren't. So that's why I don't go too deep into it, but I still like to talk about it because it is important that we understand that a majority of the works that you're going to be reading has gone through the scientific methods process. It has gone through, they have put in a certain amount of methods in order to make sure that that the conclusions are scientifically sound. So that's why I like to have this conversation, to bring that part out and to bring out the science of sociology. Let me see. So is there anything else I want to say about that? No, I think that's it. So yeah, if you're interested in more methods, you can take a research methods class. You can ask me more questions about the methods. Oh, I was gonna say, but then there are other texts like Michelle Obama's Becoming, right? There wasn't a scientific method, that's just her life story. And there's gonna be some other texts that we will read that may not have methods related to it. But most of the texts, especially the sociology ones, those will have some type of methods that are implied. And if you want to see that spelled out, then just let me know and I can point you in the direction of the methods that they use. All right. With that being said, we'll continue with this first or second slide. All right, so one thing that is done with sociology and the discipline of sociology is there is a focus of study on groups rather than the individual. So if you read and if you look at anthropological works, if you look at psychological works, even if you look at the human body, oftentimes there is a focus on the individual body, the individual's mind, a person's personal relationship with whatever, right? Wherein sociology looks at the groups, right? So we're not looking at just that individual and who they are as a person. We're looking at them as a person, but also how that person is related to whatever group they represent. So we all represent certain groups because we all are part of what we call in sociology social locations. So for example, myself, right? I am Jonathan. I am my own person. I am an individual. I have individual thoughts. I have individual behaviors. I was raised in a certain way. I have certain influences. I'm unique in certain ways. But when you see me as somebody who is a part of society, there are certain groups that I represent. Whether I want to represent the group or not, I represent that group. Number one, as soon as you see me, you can tell I'm African American or I'm of the African diaspora. What part of the African diaspora? Person may not know. I could be Jamaican, I could be British, I could be Kenyan, Nigerian, African American, whatever. You don't know, but you can clearly see me and say he's some variation of the African diaspora, right? It's likely that if you see me, you will probably assume that I am male presenting. I present as a male, right? Now, if you ask me questions, maybe, I am male, but you don't know for sure unless you ask somebody, because a person could be male presenting, but then they may not be or even identify as what they present as. But I am a cisgendered male, right? So I represent, right, a person being a part of a certain racial group, a person being a part of a certain gender group. And then there are other social locations, right, that would describe me, right? My sexuality, my educational status, my place of nativity, all of these different things describe, I represent these different groups. And so each of you also represent groups, right? You represent a racial group, a gender group, everything that I just talked about. You all are part of these different social locations, right? And so when sociologists study people, we study people, but we also study people as they are representatives or as they belong to a certain group. And so that's why we have classes on not just an individual, but on race, or not just an individual, but on gender and sexuality and place and urban space and health and religion, these larger social constructs that many of us are part of that connect to why we behave the way we do. We use a scientific method. I talked about that in the last section or in the last lecture as well. So we go beyond common sense. We don't just look and say, oh, we think people are doing this because whatever. But we actually put these theories to the test to see if it works. We put it through the scientific method, the scientific process. Also, we live in groups, and groups affect our lives. And so, as much as we want to say that we are completely individuals and we just completely do things on our own, it's not the case. We are affected by the groups that we are part of, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether purposely or not, whether by choice or inadvertently. We are affected by the groups that we belong to, the people that we're around. Now, we can overcome that by, if we don't agree with certain ways in which we were influenced, and we try to challenge that, or or we accept those ideas. It's up to us as we get older and as we become more individualized. But at the same time, the groups that we are a part of, the communities, the societies, the neighborhoods, the families, the places, the religion, the schools that we attend, whatever, these things affect who we are. All right, next slide. So when we're talking about theories, first of all, it's extremely important for us to talk about the original theorists, right? Some of the original sociological theorists, as we know in modern day sociology. Right now, if we want to go to ancient sociology, which I would love to see a class on that, and then actually go to people who, if sociology was an actual discipline, would have been considered sociologists, I think that would be an interesting class. But those people would have been considered more philosophers, right? So if you want to go back to, even if you want to go to biblical times like a Solomon or Confucius or Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha, they said a lot of sociological things, or things that would be considered sociology, but it was kind of philosophy, right? So even if you want to go to John Locke, and so many others, you could. So, but if we're talking about the modern day sociology from the 19th century on, then you're looking at folks like Darwin, Spencer, Marx, Durkheim, Nietzsche, Weber. These are philosophers / sociologists that have absolutely influenced our discipline now. If you want to talk about sociological theory, the main people that typically we talk about first, and that are part of what we call the big three, Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. In addition to that, and then so I typically talk about them when we talk about the theory part, and then I spend like 1 or 2 days talking about one of the theorists that oftentimes gets left out of this conversation, and that is W.E.B. Du Bois, the really the father of modern sociology, and the first Black sociologist of the 19th and the 20th century, the first Black modern sociologist. And so we spent some time talking about Du Bois separately, but unfortunately for a long time, people only consider Durkheim, Marx, and Weber. Not until the piece that came out, The Scholar Denied, which was written by he's a professor of sociology at Northwestern University. Not until his piece came out, Alden Moore's, that kind of changed that conversation even more. So shout out to Alden Morris for that. And I think we may even read some of The Scholar Denied this semester. So let's see. Go to the next slide. So Auguste Comte is significant when we talk about the birth of modern day sociology, but we don't consider him part of the big three, because he didn't necessarily affect sociology in a grand theoretical sense in the way that Marx, Durkheim, and Weber did. but he is responsible for giving sociology its name. And he is the one who said that we needed a scientific method, a scientific approach to studying human constructions, looking at ideas, looking at behaviors, looking at the way in which people interact with society and conclusions about our society. He was the one that said it should come from, we should use a scientific method and it should not be commonsensical, right? And so Auguste Comte would be considered one of the early kind of fathers of sociology, even though he wasn't necessarily a theoretician. And so there are four major scientific methods that sociologists typically use to come to conclusions. The first one is observation. So oftentimes we just kind of stop and look, right? And and this is just direct observation of people's behavior. I don't know if any of you have ever been people watching or like to people watch. Yeah, do you like to people watch? You like to just kind of go to the airport or go to the park or go to the beach and just watch people, just watch, just see what they do. Sometimes even make up dialogue in your mind about what they might be saying. It's fun. I like to do it. And if you do, then you're actually doing sociology, right? You're doing sociology if you do that, because that is part of what we call the observation method, right? There's another part called participant observation method, where people actually participate in a specific, activity or series of activities for whatever reason, and take notes on it and then analyze it sociologically. But observation is one. Then experimentation, so there's some type of hypothesis, and then we test it by manipulating certain factors in order to influence an outcome. So just like you would do when you were in biology class, we also do the same thing, right? You may take one group, take another group, test one group, not provide a test for another group, see what the results are. Same thing, right? Comparison, we might look at two different groups, whether it be men and women, Black people, white people, people of a certain class, or working class people versus middle class people, people of one age versus people of another age. You look at different people and then you compare them, right? Compare differences, compare similarities, and look at patterns of behavior, right? And then lastly, historical research. So sometimes we might analyze past events in order to look at what's going on in the present and in the future. So a lot of sociology comes from historians. W.E.B. Du Bois, the father of modern day sociology, was a historian. He didn't get his degree in sociology. He got his degree in history, but he used a lot of sociological methods to help explain, and he mixed it with history to explain present day racial phenomena, right? Again, Marx was a philosopher and an economist. So a lot of these early people, when sociology was first kind of coming into play, weren't necessarily sociologists, and that they didn't necessarily have degrees in it, but they used the methods, the practices, the principles in their research and their writings. And so you see a lot of similarities because a lot of sociologists are historians. I started out as a historian and then went into sociology. You also have a lot of historians that use sociological research, sociological theories to help explain a lot of ideas. So yeah, and I can give you a lot of different examples, but there are a bunch of people like that. So let's go to the big three. The big three. Karl Marx is the first of the big three that we're going to talk about. I like to also, when I talk about Marx, I also like to talk about Engels. Engels was his kind of sidekick. They did a lot of research together. A lot of people don't talk about Engels. Engels was the one who actually paid for a lot of that research. While Marx was thinking and philosophizing and pontificating and doing all these different things, it was Engels who was kind of, funding a lot of this. A lot of these, writings and books, et cetera, that helped Marx kind of do and come up with the ideas that he came up with. Marx was the one who initiated what we call conflict theory. And conflict theory basically says that conflict drives social change, right? It is the conflict between generally the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the people that own the means of production, the people that own the factories that we talked about in the last lecture, the factories, the buildings, people that own it. And then you have those, that's the bourgeoisie, and then the proletariat are the workers, the people who exchange labor for financial gain, for compensation, right? So your workers. His class analysis was very bifurcated, right? Now we understand that class is very fragmented and is more, there's more than just a binary of a proletariat bourgeoisie. And now you have a middle class, and now you have an upper middle and a lower middle class and an upper class and a, elite class and a, some countries have untouchables, or you have a below the poverty line and working class, and all these different groups, right? But Marx, his was very much proletariat bourgeoisie, right? And he believed that society only moved forward when the proletariat essentially got tired of the bourgeoisie exploiting the class for the means of production. So his argument is that most revolution, most change takes place because the poor and the rich go at it. And when the poor and the rich go at it, and whoever wins, whether the poor win or the rich win, something happens as a result to say, we need to do something to change this. Even if the rich do win, they don't necessarily want to always be fighting the poor. So they do something to make change. They have laws, they pass policies, they change traditions, something happens, and that is how our society moves forward. So it is through conflict that we move from one historical period to another. And while Marx does say this more so about class, this can be related to race, this can be related to gender. Generally, when we're reading history, we see that certain things are happening and then there's a clash. There's an industrial revolution, there is a war, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's World War I, World War II, that marks a shift in how our world is happening, how society is forming. You have something happens and then people get mad and there's protests, there's revolutions, there's movements. Something occurs to stop, shift, and then bring about some kind of change. So if we look at it, we see that Marxism may not be too far off. Everybody's not a Marxist. Everybody may not agree with Marx. Some people may disagree with Marx, but we do see that if we look at history, a lot of change occurs, a lot of drastic change occurs after there is some sort of conflict between groups, whether it be the poor and the rich, whether it be a racial minority versus a racial majority, whether it be men and women, whether it be people who are part of the LGBTQ sexual, what do they call? What is Katie Acosta calls sexually non-conforming people versus cis heterosexual people, right? Where there's some kind of conflict occurring, and then there's change. So essentially, Marx was on the side of the proletariat, right? He believed that capitalism benefited the bourgeoisie and maximized production potential in human labor, but ignored the needs of the humans that were providing the labor. And ignoring the needs but maximizing the production calls for this large level of inequality. And so his idea was that we should give power back to the workers. We should evenly distribute wealth and resources as needed, and workers have nothing to lose but their chains. He believed that workers were chained. He believed that workers were essentially enslaved, and that as a society, capitalism was the reason for why there was this large exploited class, which was a majority of people. And so his idea was that what he did essentially was he studied capitalism. He became a student of capitalism, and then he provided heavy critique of it using volumes and volumes and volumes of works. So if you read his volumes, Das Kapital, or just Capital, in English, heavy critic of of that way of life, right? Heavy critic of capitalism. All right, next, we talked about this a lot already, the conflict perspective. Next slide, conflict is the most important agent of social change. It explains the arrangement of the advantage and disadvantage groups. Conflict perspective talks about and promotes, it explains how conflict promotes and protects privileged people, or it is what causes the protection of the privilege is what causes people to get into conflict. And then it explains inequality. It explains why why some people have advantage and some people don't. All right, let's go to the next of the big three, which is Emil Durkheim. All right, so Emil Durkheim, his idea or his theory was what we call structural functionalist theory. Functionalist theory basically says that society is made up of different parts, of different functions. And so each group plays a role, right? Each group plays a role. The family is a social institution. The society is made up of all these different institutions. And the family is an institution, the church or the religious organization is an institution, the political structure is an institution, the healthcare structure is an institution, the housing structure is an institution, the criminal justice system. All these institutions work simultaneously and together to help ensure that our society is stabilized. Right, there's a certain level of, if you want to use a hard science term, homeostasis, right? There's this certain level of stability that exists within our society. Structural functionalism says that when one of those institutions fails, then all of society crumbles. And so in order for us to figure out why society is crumbling or what is going wrong, we have to fix one of whatever institution that is. So it looks at society as a body. Right, you have all these different body parts, but when one body part fails, it can affect the other body parts. Right, if your kidneys fail, it can affect. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but I imagine it affects other body parts. Right, so sometimes you may not die if you lose a thumb, right, or an ear, but there are certain body parts that if it does fail, you could die. Right. So there are certain things, so we have to fix certain parts of the body in order to keep it running properly. So that's essentially what the structural functionalist theory says. If the housing market falls, like when we saw the housing bubble happen in 2008, that affected society in a major way. That affected jobs, it affected childcare, it affected the stock market, it affected so many different things, right? So that's essentially what structural functionalism is, right? Each institution has a function, right? Has a function. And we need to make sure that all of these things are functioning simultaneously and in working order to ensure social stability. Durkheim also believed in what's called division of labor, which he says is a way that society divides tasks and services between people or groups of people for the sake of production. And so he did this to show that there's a certain level of solidarity in our society. And solidarity is just a system of social ties that connect people to one another and the larger society. And so in the Industrial Revolution changed the division of labor because it was much more complex, which changed the solidarity and cohesiveness of overall society. But an agrarian society is very simple, right? Certain people did certain things. The women, the men, the children. If we're talking about 18th and 19th century, the U.S. Society, then you had enslaved people, enslaved Africans. Everybody played a role. Everybody, whether it was equal or unequal, whether it was oppression or privilege, there was a role, and it was very clearly laid out. What the Industrial Revolution did was it complicated a lot of these roles. It complicated who did what, how, why. And so the level of solidarity that existed in society began to change, right? And so now people can belong to multiple groups, and the divisions of labor began to change and grow and become muddled as society became a bit more complicated, a bit more complex. And so a sociologist's job is to analyze the factors that affect solidarity. And when we talk about solidarity, we might be talking about like unemployment. So for example, unemployment may be studied by Marx from an economic perspective. Marx may say, we need to make sure that unemployment is low because the more people are unemployed, the more people can't take care of their families. And the more they can't take care of their families, the more they're going to find ways to get money, whether legally or illegally, whether non-violently or violently, and then eventually they're going to fight, protest, march, do something against the people that have money, against the people who own the means of production, in order to have jobs, right? So they can take care of their families. So there's going to be conflict, essentially. And if we want to keep conflict down, keep unemployment down. Durkheim says if unemployment is low, then those people who are unemployed are disconnected from society. The level of solidarity in our society gets disconnected because now these people can't do the same things they used to do before. They can't go to the same places. They don't have the same status. And so the level of solidarity in our society is now disrupted because unemployment rises. So unemployment gets same social problem, but gets looked at differently, depending whether you're looking at it from a conflict theoretical perspective or a structural functionalist theoretical perspective using solidarity. This next slide is just basically what I said, explaining functionalism. And then lastly, we have Max Weber. So Max Weber is last of the big three, one of the friends, close friends of W.E.B. Du Bois. And he studied society's effects on people's actions and the social forces that motivate those actions. His idea was looking at goals. And so he believed that in the Industrial Revolution, in a capitalist society, everybody's goal was what he called the instrumental rationale, which means you get to the goal by the most efficient means possible, right? Little code of conduct. He said that's capitalism. Whatever it takes to expand our profit margin, that's what we're gonna do, right? And so he looked at it from a spiritual perspective. He has a book called The Protestant Ethics, The Spirit of Capitalism. And I don't go much into it in this class, but in my intro to sociology class, we talk a lot about that and talk about sociology of religion. And basically, Weber's argument is that essentially capitalism became a religion. It became part of spiritually why people felt certain groups were supposed to be successful and other groups were not. And again, that's the whole Protestant ethics. He lays that all out in his early text. And what he says is that capitalism actually, when used as a spiritual foundation or spiritual backing or a spiritual argument, can actually provide a spiritual void in society because it does not allow for any type of moral framework as to why we do certain things economically, right? And it allows for people to just be able to do whatever it is that they want to do, and then use this, I guess, kind of spiritual philosophy to help explain away what it is that they want to do. And so he says that gives us an even bigger spiritual void when we use capitalism in a way that is negative and then try to explain it away using spiritual ideas. He says there are 4 types of goals. The traditional goal, which is that goals are pursued because they were pursued in the past. So if your grandfather was a doctor and and your father was a doctor or a dentist, and then you want to be a doctor or a dentist. You probably want to do it because it is part of your family tradition. Affection. So sometimes goals can be pursued in response to an emotion. You're angry about something, so you want to achieve this goal. Or there's a love, a deep love and a passion for something, so you want to achieve this goal. Many of you may be going into a particular major because for that affection goal. You have a certain passion for education, business, um, law, uh, sociology, psychology, whatever, right? That's called the affection goal. So you have the traditional, the affection, and you have the value rationale, which some people believe or place more emphasis on the journey towards the goal than the goal itself. So the value rationale, a good example would be Dr. King. And obviously his holiday is coming up very soon. And Dr. King says that in order for us to achieve freedom for all people, we have to do it in a nonviolent way. His idea was, yes, I want to achieve this goal, but the means to achieving this goal is even more important than the goal itself. If we're going to achieve this goal, it has to be through nonviolence. If we don't do it through nonviolence, then and I think he says it at the end of his last book, we are either going to be collaboratively nonviolent, or what does he say, or co-annihilation, something like that. It's really good though. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's at the very end of Chaos or Community, if you want to read it. Um, but yes, so he believed that nonviolence was the value rationale necessary for the goal, and the instrumental rationale, which is what I just said, get to the goal by the most efficient means possible. And then you had other people who are not a part of the big three, are not considered the, part of the foundation of sociology, but definitely influence sociology in a major way. Jane Addams is one powerful woman who used a lot of community-based efforts and showed how sociology can be practical. A lot of these gentlemen, if I'm honest, Marx and Weber, they're philosophizing, they're theorizing, they're writing books, but many of them are not on the ground level, working and building communities, building organizations, organizing people in order to help make change. But Jane Addams did. She used these theories and then put them into practice and created the Whole House in Chicago and addressed issues of homelessness and inadequate housing and working conditions and unemployment and prostitution. And then you had other folks like Harriet Martineau, who included women's experiences and women's lives into sociology. A lot of these early men weren't talking about women. They weren't discussing women's inequality. And so these early women had to come in and say, hey, if you're going to talk about inequality, we need to talk about issues related to marriage, children, religious life, race relations. All of these things are also important, not just class, not just the poor and the rich and those who are being economically exploited, but some people are being exploited because of their gender or because of their race or because of their religion, right? All of these things are important. Marital satisfaction should not just be for the man, it should also be for the woman. And so all of these people, these men, these women, also help to build this discipline of sociology. And so we talked about conflict theory, we talked about structural functionalism, three main theories, and then the last one is symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism observes social relations by looking at the big picture. That's the macro level sociology. But then you have the micro level, which is when we focus on these small scale interactions on the street level, children playing on the playground. And so what symbolic interactionism does is it looks at this micro level orientation of life, and it looks at how symbols shape meanings, how we attach certain meanings to reality, and then how we use that reality to define ourselves, to define our surroundings, to define our identity. And so those are the three main theories. So the three main theorists are Marx, Weber, Durkheim theories, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and then structural functionalism. So the next slide just kind of lays all of that out in a different way. And so when we look at sociology, what we see is that it is a science, right? It is a science that employs systematic methods of investigation. It evaluates theories based on evidence and logical argument. It is not modeled on the natural sciences. It is its own, so it is a part of the social sciences, and it studies humans in a fundamentally different way than the natural sciences does, okay? And sociology helps us see the world from many different perspectives. It helps us write better, and it helps us make policies that are much more informed so that we understand better the world around us and how policies will affect certain groups and make sure that it includes as many people as possible. It assesses the effects of policies that already exist, and then it helps us increase a certain level of self-understanding so that we can better understand each other. All right, so that is that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out as we now go into the methods part of the theory and methods lecture. All right, so we'll go straight into the methods portion. And this is, I mean, a lot of you may know a lot of this already, but just to do a quick review of the scientific method and, you know, how it gets carried out from a sociological perspective. We're just gonna talk about this really quickly, and then we will be done. So, all right. So, slide that says social research. So when we do social research, we are testing common sense and people's assumptions, then replace with fact and evidence. And then we make these generalizations. So just like anything, we're looking at society, we're looking at people, we're looking at organisms. If you are part of the hard sciences, you're looking at bodies, and you know, even if we look at COVID, people are just trying to figure it out. So a lot of what we do in science is based on generalizations. And it's okay to generalize, right? It's okay to say, oh, I wonder if everybody does this. I wonder if everybody, okay, I wonder if, okay, is this. So you can, because essentially that's all we have to go on when we first see something, because we can't see everything. We can't see every person, every body, every whatever. We can't see. So we have to go off of a generalization. The difference is we can't stop there, right? When we generalize, we make a statement about a group of people or things that is based on only a few people or things in that group. You can start there, but you can't end there. Because now you can say, well, I wonder, you can ask that question. And then you can say, well, in order to test that theory, I need to now put it through the scientific method. And so that's essentially what social research does, is it tests our common sense, it tests our generalizations, our assumptions, and then replace what we assume with actual facts and evidence that either support it or challenge it. So with social research, people who do medical research, their science is typically in a lab, right? Social research, where do we do research? Our whole world is the lab. The whole world is a sociologist lab, okay? That's how we do research, okay? And there's two types. You have quantitative and you have qualitative. So quantitative research relies on numerical data, where you take responses, you quantify them into zeros, ones, twos, threes, fours, and then you put them through a statistical method, okay? Qualitative research uses observation, sorry, not statistical method, a statistical analysis program, right? Qualitative, we use research using observation and rely on descriptive data, right? So with qualitative, interviews, um, participant observation, focus groups, all of these are the various ways in which we take people's experiences and then we analyze them and then we come up with conclusions. Usually not generalizable. Very rare do you find qualitative data that is generalizable, because it's not, the sample size generally isn't big enough, because you're typically not going to get 1,000 interviews, right? Or 2,000 interviews. Typically you might get 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 10,000 people in a quantitative study, right? Because it's a lot easier. Qualitative, 10,000 interviews, you're not going to transcribe all of that. So it makes it difficult to generalize, but it still adds to the conversation and it gives some scientific basis for certain dialogue and certain perspectives, right? Then we said it was two, but really it's three. So you got quantitative, qualitative, and then you have mixed methods. You can do both. You can do quantitative and qualitative. Experiment research that takes place in a lab setting. So that's limited use in social research. Typically, our research is field research, where we actually go out into the field where the individuals are that we're studying, and we actually go out into the field and then conduct the research. Some of the methods that are used to conduct research that you will see that was used to conduct some of the studies that we're going to read about this semester. One is surveys. Typically, surveys are used. Take these surveys and then you quantify them. You apply numbers to them, apply representation or symbols to them nominally, and then you put it through a statistical analysis database. So research methods in which people respond to questions generally is what you'll find in like a survey. Questionnaires, asking a sample population to respond to a series of kind of closed-ended questions. And then you have interviews. So those are more open-ended questions. Questionnaire surveys you'll find in a lot of quantitative work. Interviews you'll find in a lot of qualitative work, where people, you might ask a person a question about how they feel about a particular thing, and then they'll respond to it, and then you analyze that. Some other methods that we might use, though, we talked about this a little bit earlier, secondary historical analysis. So we might read books, documents on a particular topic, person, use that as data and research on the topic. So the first study that I ever did was a historical analysis. Sometimes we might do a case study, right? Where we may do an in-depth examination of one specific group or one specific problem in a community, right? So if we want to look at certain levels of inequality in Jacksonville, let's say economic inequality, well, there are several different places in Jacksonville where there are large amounts of poverty and concentrated poverty. We may use one neighborhood as a case study. We may use one neighborhood as a focus, right? And use that to explain poverty in Jacksonville, right? Sometimes we might do longitudinal studies, right? So you might study the same group over time. If you want to study a group of students in a middle school, and you say, I want this to be a longitudinal study. So you study that group in 6th grade and study them in 8th grade. Then you may want to study them again in 9th grade, then study them in 12th grade to see how education ideas, factors have been manipulated and changed that could affect your outcome, okay? Then natural observation, again, is just observing people in their natural environment. Not saying much, not influencing or manipulating factors, just watching, right? We talked about that, people watching. Participant observation is when the researcher actually becomes involved in the study. So if you wanted to do a study on protest movements, right, then you might actually get involved in the NAACP chapter in Jacksonville. You might actually get involved in a movement that is being carried out on campus. And not only are you involved, you're participating in it, but then now you're interviewing people and you're talking to people and you're asking and answering, asking questions, and that is participant observation, right? That's where you get a lot of your ethnographic research. So these are the different ways in which data collection occurs. And then it is then put through the social research method or the scientific method. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna find a topic and we're gonna ask a question. What is it that we're trying to figure out? What do we wanna know? What questions are we trying to ask, and what answers are we looking for, right? For a particular, for whatever reason, something we might be passionate about or interested in. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to collect literature on it, because as the old saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. So whatever it is that you want to read or study, likely somebody else has already read and studied it. Now, they may not be answering the exact same questions that you're answering, but they talked about the topic to some degree. So you can learn and you can find out, or you can even find out, you might find a study that answers your exact same question. Happens to researchers all the time. We have a question and we're thinking, oh, nobody's asked this question before. And then we comb through the literature and there's a whole study that is exactly our question. And we're like, oh, so now I got to change it. It happens to you all the time when you're a PhD student writing a dissertation. You think you're original, then you're not. But it's not hard to change. You can, a lot of times that might have been for a particular city or a state. You can just kind of sometimes move it, change a few things to make yours a little bit more unique. You learn how to do that as you matriculate through the discipline. But essentially, you need to comb through the literature, find out what other people said about the topic, know what has already been studied and uncovered. So then you can know how to contribute to it and how your study is going to be any different. Okay. Then have a hypothesis. What do you think is going to be the answer? How do you explain the phenomenon? And then plan out your research. What methods are you going to use to collect your data? How are you going to collect your data? What is your timeline? Who are you going to study? Are you going to do surveys, interviews, secondary analysis? Are you going to do your study over 2 weeks, a couple months? Is it going to take a year? How many people are you going to study? Why? So now you have to answer all these questions. What does it mean? What are the concepts you're using? How are you going to conceptualize and operationalize these ideas and these procedures? You have to do all of that in your research plan. And after you've done that, and it all makes sense, then you go out and collect your data. What are your independent variables? What are your dependent variables? What is being measured? What is being manipulated? And yeah, find out what is the cause and what is the effect. We typically don't say cause. We're not really trying to get at causality, but what is being influenced and what is doing the influencing, right? Then, after you've analyzed your data, after you've looked at patterns and relationships and correlations and sometimes causations, and you can see, okay, well, this connects to this. And a lot of people say this is the reason why they did this. And every time I saw this, I saw this. And every time I saw, and this was something that came up a lot. And what does this mean? And so now that you've seen the patterns, now that you're coming to some kind of a solution or conclusion or some kind of explanation, now you can start to write it all out. Now you can start to explain it, and then you can state your conclusions. What generalizations can be drawn from your results? Doesn't mean that you are answering the questions to everything about that topic, but you're helping to bring about some conclusions. So what are some things that you can generalize and ideas that you can take from this study? Did you prove your hypothesis or did you disprove it, right? Was it correct? Was it incorrect? Right? So that's what you get when you come to your conclusion. about your study, your topic, right?
Okay, so really quickly, I forgot to insert your assignments. So I'll do that here. Um, I'm actually going to do that here, and then I'll insert it into the video later. Um, so, so your assignment uh, for theory and methods, where we talk about the classical sociologists, you have a discussion post activity, and it goes like this. If your last name ends in A through G, your sociologist is Karl Marx. If your last name ends in H through P, your sociologist is Max Weber. If your last name ends in Q through T, your sociologist is Emil Durkheim. If your last name ends in W through Z, your sociologist is Jane Addams. And what you are required to do is engage in a discussion board post entitled Classical Sociologist. Make sure you go back to the syllabus to look at how you're supposed to do a discussion board post. And this one is due before 11:59 on May 20th. And make sure that you do not only do a discussion board post, but you will also answer and respond to another student's post. So what you're going to do is, in each of these situations below, you're going to, in your discussion post, you're going to explain how your sociologist, whichever one falls under your last name, would examine this problem, right? How would they look at this issue? What aspects of the problem do you think your sociologist would focus on? Which part of the problem would have the biggest impact on society based on what your sociologist would say? And what conclusions would your sociologist come to about the problem? So, for example, if you have Karl Marx, then you're going to do a post that says, where you say basically, an undocumented worker has been threatened with deportation. This is what I believe Karl Marx would say about an issue like that. If you have Max Weber, this is what I think Max Weber, his approach based on, the functionalist theory, or Karl Marx's approach based on conflict. This is what I believe how they would approach the issue. Jane Addams, I think, would approach it in this way. This is how she would understand an undocumented worker being threatened with deportation. Same thing with an unarmed Black woman from a low income neighborhood being killed in police custody. How would Emil Durkheim view this, right? How would Marx view this? And so I want you to do that for each one of those examples. A woman quits her job after being sexually harassed by her boss. What would Marx say about something like that? How would he focus on that? So I want you to take each of these sociologists, how their particular perspective on society, on sociology. I want you to take that and then apply that to each of these situations. And how do you think they would deal with it? How do you think they would examine the problem? What parts of the problem would they focus on? Because each one of them will focus on different parts of it. Which parts, according to them, would have the biggest impact? And what conclusions would they come to, you think they would come to, based on their perspective of society and social problems? So I want you to do that. Do a post about that. That should be, a nice little extensive post. And then I want you to respond to another student's post, using information from the lecture, from the reading and that sort of thing. Using that information to talk about yours as well as respond to another student's. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. Yeah.
If you have any questions, reach out to me during office hours. I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you just want to talk about the topics, we can. You can reach out to me, or you can email me, or you can inbox me, and I'll respond during my office hours. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.